Hi there, I'm Andrew. I am the Curator of Interpretation for Johnson County Museum, and we're going to do a little overview of our main tour today, talking about some things in our permanent exhibit, Becoming Johnson County is its name. And so we're going to start right here in the beginning of the tour. This is where we talk about the story beginning, right? And so the first peoples in the area that we now call Johnson County were Native Americans, the Missouri, the Kansa, the Osage, lots of names in this area for those cultures that lived here for hundreds of years. They didn't leave much permanent mark on the terrain, right? Lots of place names for them now, but not a lot of permanent structures or settlements. They were nomadic, semi-nomadic. They moved around with animals, followed the trails, fished, had seasonal camps, summer and winter villages, towns that they created and lived in. And so really until the 16 or 1700s, there was not any contact with Europeans or people from the United States. I'll call them Americans. After about 1700, we start to see the French come through this area, fur trapping, using the rivers as roads and highways. Late 1500s, we see the Spanish coming into the state, not as far as Johnson County, but they're going to places like Junction City, Garden City, middle of the state, down towards Arkansas as well. And it's really in the early 1800s when people from the United States, people from Europe start to come through this area in larger numbers. And it's in the 1820s, after 1825, that the Shawnee are removed here by the federal government. A policy of removal. You remove a people. And the government said the Shawnee people couldn't stay in the Ohio River Valley, their ancestral lands anymore. They needed to move west to open land for settlement. And so the Shawnee were removed into Kansas and placed on a reservation here. And that's when we start to see missionaries and more permanent settlement come into the area, like Thomas Johnson, the county's namesake. He was a missionary with the Shawnee Methodist Mission, which is located in Fairway, Kansas today. He came in the late 1820s and by 1839 had set up in Fairway. And after 1821, we see more and more people coming across the landscape. Not a lot of permanent settlement still, but people going on the Santa Fe Trail after 1821, down into New Mexico, which at that point was part of the country of Mexico. In the 1840s, we see the Oregon Trail and the California Trail open up, and more people coming across Johnson County. And in fact, leaving from Independence and later from Westport, Johnson County was your first night on the trail. You'd spend your first night in Johnson County, getting used to being on the trail, getting used to being in that bumpy wagon. There were campsites across the county as different trails diverged and converged. And so lots of folks were moving across Johnson County, but not lots of folks were staying yet. So the next major section in the museum talks about what we call the 10 years of terror. You probably learned it in school as Bleeding Kansas. It was the era after 1854 when Kansas was opened up for settlement. Congress sort of shirked its typical responsibility of declaring a territory to be slave-owning territory or a free territory, and instead they went with this new idea called popular sovereignty. And Congress said people in a territory should decide those major things that are going to govern the territory and later a state's life. They said people in that state, people in Kansas and Nebraska, should vote on the issue of slavery if they want to become a slave-owning state or not. And so after 1854, when Kansas opens up for settlement, we see some major conflicts start. In that period from 1854 to 1861, there are 4 separate constitutions written for a presumptive state of Kansas. There are 19 governors and acting governors in Kansas, sometimes multiple at the same time. You have neighbors who have very different ideas about what the world should look like and who counts as a person, what the economy should look like, and they're living right next to each other. And that's why the shotgun we have in our collection is here. Neighbors often came to blows. Different cities had different affiliations, sometimes slave-owning, sometimes free, and they would clash. And there were lots of guerrilla bands, which our friend James Lane here, William Quantrill on the other side, actually had bands of followers and fought as guerrilla bands, vigilantes, so to speak, fighting against each other. And once the Civil War comes to Kansas after the 1860s, after 1861, they become a Union and a Confederate officer, and they actually lead officers and troops for those sides of the Civil War. And during that period, there are lots of different battles, lots of different sacking of towns in Johnson County specifically. This is the Kansas side of the state line. This is Missouri. The red line here represents State Line Road today. And you'll see a map here that talks about the different sacking of towns, burning of towns. Shawnee was burned, Olathe was sacked. Of course, Lawrence was probably the most famous. A major battle occurred there and the town was burned. And so probably the most important thing that came out of this period, besides setting up this real animosity between neighbors and between different factions, was General Order Number 11. And the Union Army eventually took control of this area, but there were lots of Confederate sympathizers, slave owners, especially on the Missouri side, and they were aiding and abetting William Quantrill and his men. And so General Order Number 11 said anybody in 5 counties along this state line here, from Kansas City on down, on the Missouri side, that didn't live in a city needed to get to a city or get out of the countryside and move deeper into the state. And then the Union Army went through and burned most of the fields and farms and houses of Confederate sympathizers that lived there, so that there wouldn't be food and shelter and supplies for any Confederate sympathizers that remained. And that really created some issues in the area, of course. That's why we don't see a lot of historic homes from the 1850s, 1860s on the Missouri side, right along state line. There's very few, and those that remain are probably Union sympathizers. So of course, coming out of the Civil War period, Kansas enters the Union in 1861 as a free state. Really after the Civil War is when we start to see regular business go back about, right? There's so much fighting during the Civil War period that a lot of lives were really disrupted and a lot of lives were lost in the area. From 1854 and then after the Civil War, Johnson County is mainly agricultural. There's lots of farmland here, right? Some great prairies and things that were being turned into farmland. And to begin with, it's subsistence farming. And you can see a great quote up here about Johnson County's land, very fertile. Subsistence farming means growing a little bit of everything that you would need to subsist, to be able to live. So farmers in this period, they were growing different fruits and vegetables, they were growing grains, they might have an orchard, they had cows and pigs and chickens, all of these things in small quantities. And if they had anything left over at the end of the season, they might trade it with their neighbors for something they weren't able to grow or something they needed. But very few farmers were able to produce any surplus and take it to a market during subsistence farming. It's after 1869, when the Hannibal Bridge comes into Kansas City, Missouri, that Johnson County really changes. The Hannibal Bridge, which is basically at the foot of Broadway today, where that bridge goes across to the old airport in Kansas City, the Hannibal Bridge was located there. The original bridge is gone and one has been built in its place. But it was the first permanent railroad bridge across the Missouri River. Not even St. Louis had one before this. So this was a huge deal for this area, and it opened up trade to places like Chicago and New York City, and eventually places like Chicago and New York City were able to transport things down to the Gulf Coast through this area as well, all coming through Kansas City, down into Dallas and on. So this is a massive deal for this area. And what it did was really increase the amount of rail activity in Johnson County to a level that most rural places, most agricultural places wouldn't have seen. So of course, Olathe, Shawnee, Lenexa have rail depots, but places like Wilder, Gardner, Edgerton, DeSoto, very small towns, kind of on the fringes. In most places, they wouldn't have a rail depot. They would have to transport overland to a rail depot. But because Johnson County is so close to Kansas City and so close to this very important rail bridge, they get their own rail depots. And so farmers go from subsistence farming, like we were talking about, into truck farming or large-scale agriculture. And this, of course, is a truck from the 1920s or 1930s with literally tons of cabbage, and that's a great example. So farmers in Johnson County went from growing everything they would need to maybe just 1 or 2 crops. You might grow cabbage. In Lenexa, of course, they're the spinach capital of the world, right, for a while. Along the river bottoms, they were growing potatoes. Other orchards and fruits and things in Johnson County were huge. And you're growing massive fields of them. You're able to load them on wagons or later onto trucks, take them to those rail depots and ship them out. Your surplus ends up being money that you can then spend in towns that are starting to really grow, like Olathe, Shawnee. Hire Boot Company was a major firm in Olathe. And as people start to move into towns and accumulate wealth and things, that's where this big old cannonball safe comes in right here in the center, this big gray thing. This was supposed to be dynamite proof because of its rounded shape. Any blast would just kind of ricochet off the sides. Not sure how well that actually would have worked, but this would have held money or other valuables, bullion, gold bars, that sort of thing. The land records for in Johnson County would have been very important. And the last thing about agriculture in Johnson County that was so important to the entire Kansas City metro area was dairying. At some point in the late 1800s, there were as many as 200 to 300 dairies in the county. Of course, those end up consolidating. Lots of them go out of business. Many of them were just families with a few cows providing milk to a certain neighborhood. But as they consolidate and grow into larger firms like the Zardas, for example, very well-known name in the area, they were providing milk into Kansas City, right? Into a place where people weren't able to have their own cows, weren't able to make their own cheese and cream and things. And so Johnson County and other rural areas in Kansas and Missouri were really making it possible to live in a large city like Kansas City, Missouri. And at the very end of the century, as we get into the 20th century and our suburbs start to appear, you start to see these old dairy farms, these old agricultural plots start to turn into these massive suburban developments. And that's the next chapter in our tour. So at the same time that agriculture was still really important in Johnson County, we start to see the first suburbs develop. This is in the early 1900s. Two gentlemen had the exact same idea at roughly the same time. William B. Strang ran a trolley line out of Kansas City to Overland Park, and Richard Hawker did the same thing, coming out of Kansas City into the Merriam area. There's Hawker Grove, a neighborhood that exists there today. And they were both wanting to create essentially the first bedroom communities in Johnson County. And they said, wouldn't it be wonderful if you could hop on a trolley from your home out in the clean country air and be downtown within half hour to 45 minutes. And that's exactly what they did. So in their neighborhoods, which were pretty much middle class neighborhoods, maybe upper middle class, you see executives from the garment district in downtown or railroad executives and engineers living in these homes and still being able to commute into Kansas City at the same time. And they really laid the foundation for more suburban development. And we'll talk about that over here. So while William Strang and Richard Hawker were talking about homes that had garden plots behind them, maybe a few chickens, a goat if you wanted, maybe a cow if you had a larger plot, you know, these middle class homes, this is Overland Park up here. J.C. Nichols, another developer who was creating some suburbs, was thinking about people who would want to have a garden party. Now mind you, this image here is from 1932. Depths of the Depression, and these folks are still having garden parties, right? So he's building neighborhoods and homes for wealthy individuals, country estates essentially, people who have a lot of horses, they might have stables. There was a fox hunting club in the area of his neighborhood, so he was really focusing on a different clientele. And between these different folks and all the farms that still existed, we really start to see some stratification in the types of people living in Johnson County, which leads us into the next section of the tour. So just before World War II started, J.C. Nichols and other developers were starting to create the first real suburbs. Places like Fairway, places like Westwood Hills, Mission Hills, some of those areas are really the first suburban developments of entire neighborhoods of Johnson County. And at that point, contractors were able to build between 7 and 10 houses per year because they had special craftsmen, people laying brick, people doing the woodwork, people doing the plaster work, doing the framing of the house. And so while they were building neighborhoods, they were only able to do as many houses as they had craftsmen. Other issues during that period were arising, right? The Great Depression was a major issue for the United States. Home ownership and home purchases were down. People weren't able to afford buying houses. Most people were struggling to be able to purchase necessities to be able to live. And so Franklin D. Roosevelt's administration creates the FHA, the Federal Housing Authority, in 1934. And the goal of this bureaucracy, this program, is to get more Americans in homes, owning homes. And so before the FHA existed, most Americans would have to put down 30 to 50% of the home and pay it off within 5 years, which is pretty unattainable when we think about home prices today. Same then, most people weren't able to save up that amount of money. What the FHA did was basically flip those numbers. They said, okay, put down about 10%, 20% of the cost of the home and pay it off over the next 25 or 30 years. That makes home ownership much more attainable for lots of individuals. Coming out of World War II, we also see the VA, the Veterans Administration, and they created the GI Bill, which provided a lot of help for soldiers returning after the war. They didn't want to live with their parents anymore. They wanted to own their own homes, have their own slice of the American dream, so to speak. And so the VA provided assistance along with the FHA to veterans so that they could own their own homes. And this is when we really see a massive population boom in Johnson County. So in 1940, just before the war, the population of the county was 33,000, a little more than 33,000. World War II happens, 1950, the population has almost doubled to 62,000. Within 10 more years, in 1960, it's more than doubled to 143,000. These are staggering numbers. This is that agricultural land, those dairies, those truck farms that we were talking about, being turned into neighborhoods like you see here. So the neighborhood that you see here is part of Prairie Village, really booming after World War II. And we see this population boom, this housing boom in Johnson County for one main reason. Whereas before the war, they were constructing 7 to 10 houses a year with craftsmen. During the war, something really new had happened. There was prefabrication. As military installations were moving along the front in Europe and in Asia, things needed to be built and unbuilt and reassembled, right, many times. Housing for soldiers, mess halls, medical supplies, medical tents and things. And so after the war, that prefabrication comes back to the civilian sector. And in Prairie Village specifically, one of J.C. Nichols' developments, they're completing one home per day in a 23-step process. Simplified home building, made it so that anybody could build that house. It was all prefab, it was all pre-measured. You just assembled it, put some nails in, and you were done with the house. As we're talking about the suburbanization of Johnson County, one thing that's really important to talk about is the history of redlining. This mainly took place in Kansas City, Missouri, but it impacted Johnson County in so many ways, so many very important ways. And so the map that you see here was called a residential security map. It's also called a redlining map. The FHA, that Federal Housing Administration, and the HOLC, the Homeowners Loan Corporation, were created at roughly the same time in the 1930s. And in trying to put more Americans into houses, they decided to codify neighborhoods. And so we see 4 different colors here. Sometimes they're called first, second, third, fourth. Sometimes they're called A, B, C, D. Green is the newest neighborhood. What it would mean is it's a homogeneous neighborhood. All white is what that means. Typically brand new homes. Blue would be still new, a little slightly older. Yellow is older homes that are falling into disrepair. Still an all-white neighborhood though. That's the important differentiation between yellow and red. When you get into red-lined neighborhoods or red-shaded neighborhoods, this is where you start to see minority populations. In Kansas City, mainly African Americans. On the west side, eventually it would become red-lined because of Latinos. In other places like New York City, you might see Jewish populations thrown into the mix. In places like San Francisco, you would have red-lined Asian American communities. And so any minority population, any population that wasn't white, was typically redlined. And what the HOLC said was these neighborhoods that are in red and the ones that are in yellow, about to become red, were not insurable for mortgages. You couldn't issue a mortgage insurance there because the homes would decrease in value. And so it was a risky investment for the bank. And so as the FHA and the HOLC went through and codified these neighborhoods, they exempted people from being able to take advantage of the FHA programming. They put out basically a blanket statement that said that African Americans could not participate in the FHA programming in these new mortgage terms. Any neighborhood like Prairie Village that was built with FHA funding as an entire subdivision, they were not able to purchase a home there. And so this is the federal government dictating who and who cannot participate in suburbanization. This is also happening on the individual contractor and real estate developer level as well. Deed restrictions, sometimes called racial covenants like the one we see here, this is from Leawood Estates in the 1950s. These were on individual properties, a deed restriction. And this one very clearly says no portion of this land shall be sold, leased, rented, used, owned, occupied by any person of the Negro blood, any person who is Jewish, Persian, Arabian. If you were in Dallas, it would say Hispanic or Latino. If you were in San Francisco, again, it would say Asian. New York City or New Jersey, Jewish would be pretty explicit in there. And so this governed a single property. So what J.C. Nichols did, he said, you know, this isn't good enough on individual properties. Let's apply it to an entire neighborhood, like Mission Hills or Prairie Village. He started homes associations. And so when he created this entire subdivision, he created a series of laws that went along with it that governed the entire neighborhood as a homes association. And to purchase a piece of land here in Mission Hills, you would have to sign off on those laws to be able to even purchase there. And one of those laws was almost always something like the deed restriction you see here. No African American can purchase here. Some neighborhoods, no Jewish families can purchase here. Right along with other things like you can't paint your house purple, you can't have a goat shed in the backyard, and you have to have, a 20-foot setback from the road to your front door. And this was just in this, that's why you see this number here. It was just in a list of rules that governed your property. So redlining in Kansas City created what they called white flight. And so these newer neighborhoods that you see down here, people were moving out of these neighborhoods because they were afraid they couldn't get mortgage insurance anymore. So they moved south in Kansas City and eventually moved across the state line, fleeing white flight, areas that were redlined, and so typically areas that were African American and other minority populations. And so this process, from the federal government to individual contractors and real estate developers, really drove the population that you see in Johnson County. And that's why when we're in 1980 for our population census, we still see about 96–97% white population. Even in 2010, the last census, it was 87%. So this long history of white flight, redlining, deed restrictions has led to the population and the types of neighborhoods that we see in Johnson County today. All right, so we're here inside the 1954 AllElectric House. It's the museum's largest collection item. It's an actual house, a ranch-style home. It's built in 1954 as part of an all-electric neighborhood. It's built by Kansas City Power and Light Company. And this particular house was the show house. So about 60,000 people toured this home over a 6-month period. And eventually it was sold. 5 different families lived here over the next 40 years until the 1990s, when the last family wanted to build something a little larger. This is 2 bedrooms, 1 bath. And so they wanted to construct a larger home, and they realized the treasure that they had. They had original blueprints for the home and some other details about it. And so they called up the museum and asked if we would like it as a donation. And the director at the time had the foresight to say yes, and it was jacked up, put on a trailer, and moved in one piece to the old location at Lackman. And then just a few years ago, the same thing was done, and it was moved into this building, backed in on a trailer. And so I always like to say this is the 3rd home for this house, which is a little unusual, right? So this house really is special for a couple of reasons, and I hope you take the virtual tour that we have online. You can tour the entire home like you're actually here. But I do want to point out some of the more interesting things that made this house an all-electric house. It was advertised at the time as a lazy man's paradise, and there's a few reasons for that. Everything in the house, just about, is on switches. So for example, I pick up a switch like this, and this controls the curtains here by the window. So you wouldn't actually have to get up and open curtains. The same is true in the bedrooms. One of the switches in the bedroom controls an outlet in the kitchen, which starts a coffee percolator in the morning before you even get out of bed. The other really fancy thing about this house is the television. And so you may be asking yourself, where is the television? Well, there's a painting over here that when I flick this same switch that you just saw, a different switch here, it'll actually open up, it'll actually open up and reveal the television behind that painting. Now there are speakers built into the ceiling in here. There were speakers outside on the patio that was out back, and that would allow you to watch and listen to television through this big picture window on a beautiful spring day like we're having right now. The other really interesting thing about this house are moon glow night lights that are along the baseboards. There are electrical outlets every 3 feet or so. And then there's a fireplace, and of course this is just for ambiance, but there's a switch here. You flick it on, a little crackling fire, a little ambiance, flickering going on. The entire home was heated with a heat pump, which was more efficient than other means of heating a home at the time. And so this really was a very special house when it was built in 1954. So coming out of the all-electric house, that's really the American dream, right? Lots of folks were moving to the suburbs in order to get a little slice of that American dream, a piece of property of their own. And they were moving to Johnson County in the 1950s and 1960s for that very reason. Most folks were still tied to Kansas City, Missouri in lots of ways. They were working downtown, they were shopping downtown. Often they had friends and relatives who were still living in the city. And so even though you might live in Johnson County, you were still dependent on downtown Kansas City, Missouri for lots of things. And so stores, the garment district was huge, right? You would go downtown to the Macy's store or to the Hartsfield store. But as more and more folks, more and more people start moving into Johnson County, we start to see shopping centers spring up. They're planned into places like Prairie Village, Corinth Square, but more and more there's focus on building specific places to do your shopping, and there you would need less reliance on downtown Kansas City. So this Hartsfeld store door came from the Corinth Square Shopping Center in Prairie Village, for example. And so Metcalf South, Ranch Mart Shopping Center, eventually the Oak Park Mall. These things all took the place of going into downtown Kansas City to do your shopping, and so you could start to live and play in Johnson County. You could also eventually start to work here as well. Of course, there were jobs all along, but as more and more people were moving into the county, into the suburbs, more jobs were starting to spring up. Originally, it was light industry jobs like Delco Battery, you see here. Things like Lee Jeans, the Gill Studios creating the first pressure-sensitive labels, also called bumper stickers, here in the county. Garmin eventually opens. And as more of these light industry type businesses appear, we start to see more headquartering. Corporate Woods develops with hundreds of different companies, headquarters and offices located there. Black & Veatch was one of the main firms that really built a campus in the area. Eventually Sprint builds their campus in the county. And so today we see a pretty big change here, especially on this selected industries chart. So whereas in the 70s and things, we still had a fair amount of manufacturing happening and still do today, you can see really the services, the retail taking off. And that's where our headquartering comes in, that's where the warehousing comes in. Places like the Intermodal Hub down in Edgerton and Gardner play into the county's history. And so now, today, more folks drive into Johnson County to work than drive out of into Kansas City to work, which is a pretty staggering thing to think about. Johnson County has become a place in its own right where you can live, work, and play. And so it has become a real hub in its own right and has its own identity outside of being a suburb of Kansas City, Missouri. So as we stand here in front of the Whitehaven sign, this was a really iconic location in Johnson County, just here on Metcalf Avenue, about 80th. There was a motel there for a long time called the Whitehaven Motor Lodge. This is the sign that was located there. It was sort of a beacon in the middle of the community. We've talked about a lot of different things, a lot of different historical eras and events and people in Johnson County's history today, but I really want to encourage you to come in and see the museum for yourself. Take a guided tour or go through at your own pace. There's so many more stories to tell here, so many more things to learn, a lot of nostalgia, and a lot of really important history. Thanks for listening, and we hope we see you soon.